Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this conversation. Every year, Oxfam releases a report about inequality, measuring it across the world, also measuring it specifically for India. This year, interestingly, the report is called the Inequality Virus Report because it not only maps inequality between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, it also talks about the impact that the pandemic and the lockdown has had on inequality in India. Now, here's a quick look at what this sounds like from the report. Global billionaires' wealth rose 19% during the period of the lockdown and the pandemic, which was that 1 year. 500 of the richest people in the world gained $809 billion across the world. In India, that spike for billionaire wealth was 35%. So 19% on average around the world, 35% in India. 11 billionaires in India have enough money to fund Manrega for the next 10 years. Now, this is actually also made worse by the fact that many people lost their jobs, that many people and the poor suffered from a lack of being cut off from education, being cut off from their jobs, being cut off from healthcare. And we're going to take a look at where this leaves us now as a country. Joining me right now, Amitabh Behar is the CEO of Oxfam India. Amitabh, thank you for joining us and giving us your time to talk about this report. You've called it the inequality virus. And straight up question, did COVID make inequality much worse, especially in India?
So thank you, Faye, for inviting me. I think the title of this report is very, very apt. It certainly is telling us two things. One, that the inequality virus, which surprisingly a lot of people initially said does not discriminate, it affects everybody in the same way, is not correct. That was a myth. It's very clear that the impact is very, very different. But the second thing I think which is also critical is for us to understand is that the recovery has also been differential. So you were talking about what's happened with the wealth. Let me just add another data point. The top 1,000 billionaires globally did take a hit initially, but within 9 months, they've come back to their pre-pandemic levels. Whereas now, almost all studies, including the World Bank study, which has come out recently, is telling us that average common people, poor people, will take at least a decade to come back to their pre-pandemic level. So these are two very, very clear things. And if you just dig deeper into the report, it obviously will then show you that the inequality in COVID times also has a gender dimension to it. It has a race dimension to it. In the Indian context, it certainly looks at rural-urban divide, etc. So I think it tells us a picture which intuitively many of us were aware of, but surprisingly policymakers and others were ignoring.
Well, is this accurate? And I'm reading out of the Hindustan Times report on your report. It says India's top 100 billionaires have seen their fortunes increase by 12,97,822 crore rupees since March last year when COVID hit. And this amount is enough to give 13 crore of the poorest in our country a check for 94,000 rupees each. This Absolutely. Is just the increase of the last 1 year.
Exactly. So I just didn't want to interrupt you, but when you were doing your statistics earlier, yes. You talked of the wealth of the top 11 billionaires in India being able to sustain NREGA. It's not their wealth, it's the increase in their wealth during this which can sustain NREGA for 10 years, or for that matter, the health ministry for 10 years. So that's the level of gains they have made.
Well, I want to talk about specifics, if I may, and there are a lot of very interesting details in this report. The first one, of course, is education, and we've tracked that through the year about the fact that we know that, and there was no option. Education had to be made online because children couldn't come to school. But while, and you've pointed this out in the report, while for a person from a well-to-do family, a child will have internet, will have electricity, will have space to themselves to be able to do this, On the other hand, a child from a family that is not wealthy might not have access to internet, might not have access to even electricity, in the very basic a device in which they can download videos and participate in online classrooms. What has this meant to education, and how wide is that inequality? And do we know what the dropout rate is going to be because of it?
So it's going to be a huge challenge once children start returning back. We did a survey as Oxfam a couple of months ago, in which a significant number of teachers who were surveyed have this feeling that we'll not see children coming back to school. So we're going to see a significant dropout post schools reopen. There's Malala Fund, which has actually done a study which says that 20 million girls will probably not be able to come back to school. So it specifically talks of girls not being able to come back to school. And as you said, ultimately it is about the digital divide that we've created. So this is going to be a lost year for a significant number of children. Just to add some figures to the point of digital divide, if you look at rural India, the penetration of computers in terms of children's access to computers is, let me just give you the specific figure, 4%. And for internet, it is around 15%. And within this, if you actually look at the bottom 20%, then it goes down to only access of 3% and 9% of internet. So it's pretty much that most of the children, an overwhelming number of children, have not been to school this year. This is a myth that online classes are working well. And our report actually has the figures, which further tells you that if it's a scheduled tribe household, then the access is even worse. So you're really looking at a situation where, along with the inequality that's already stratified in the society, you have further disadvantage in terms of education. And that's what we're going to look at once schools reopen.
And of course, I mean, we've been proud enough in India about our penetration of smartphones and, of bandwidth and data. But we must realize that in a family of 5, where there are 3 children, all either in school, and there's one device between parents and children, who gets to use that device? And in that case, Amitabh, what happens to the girl children? Is there a disadvantage there?
Well, there's a huge disadvantage. As in, Faye, I was giving you data from rural India. From my own experience in Delhi,
Yes.
from my colleagues who work with me, the people I interact with, not everybody is able to afford the number of devices that are needed at home. And parents are also working from home. They have their own computers. You have 2 kids. So, it certainly is a huge, huge issue. And as I talked of Malala Fund, it's usually the girls who will not have access to the devices that are needed. So what you're looking at is a huge challenge after schools reopen.
A huge challenge because children will have dropped out and we'll need to find a way to bring them back.
Absolutely. As in the massive efforts that we've done over the years of bringing children to school, that's going to take a huge hit. And the sad bit, I would say, is that we have not adequately identified this as an issue. So we're talking of multiple things in terms of how do we, say, reboot ourselves? What's the COVID recovery plan? At least in terms of economic aspects, there is some conversation. I might have disagreement with the line, but this is a conversation which is not even happening.
I must remind our viewers that bringing children to school and then making sure children stay in school, especially girl children, is a multi-decade project. We have been at it as a country for decades, and this is going to set us back. We're going to have to start bringing people back to school again. And as there is inequality in wealth, which means the poor have definitely gotten poorer, they are likely to pull their preteen and teen children out of school and send them to work, which brings us to the informal workers. Now, again, we saw those visuals, which none of us will forget, Amitabh, of workers walking back to their villages. Newspaper reports have told us that they've all come back now. Things are improving. The economy is improving. Car sales have gone up. Is that what you found on the ground as well? Have they come back? Have they got their jobs back? Is that possible even?
So we're clearly seeing that the economy is in recession.
Hmm.
And what we saw was massive retrenchment. What we've seen is that, we saw almost 122 million jobs going away. And these were all predominantly in the informal sector. And again, in the informal sector, you have who are essentially constituting the informal sector, and they're the workers in the informal sector. In the informal sector, they are the ones who do not have job security. They do not have social security. They do not have other benefits. So at least the ground reports that we have got, this study does not look at actually doing a survey of people returning, but the work we do, it's very evident that people are going through an extremely difficult situation, and they're not being able to put food on their tables. So that's the level of destitution that you're looking at. Yeah.
Amitabh, if we divide it, there's, like you said, there's a formal and the informal, and we've had organizations like CMIE put out data of what's happening to salaried jobs, because a lot of salaried people have either lost their jobs or taken pay cuts. And I'm going to come to that in a second, but I first want to address this informal sector that you're talking about. Many economists have said that when the economy opens up, or when the lockdown opens up, many people in the informal sector will regain their jobs. Have you seen that as something that has happened? Uh, have people in the informal sector regained the jobs that they lost? And if not, how long will it be before they get those jobs again?
Sorry. Yeah, you were frozen for a second. Sorry. Yeah. So you said, how long will this take? Yeah.
Yes.
So, it's difficult for me to predict how long will it take. As I said, studies are telling us that for poor ordinary people, it's going to take a decade to come back to pre-pandemic levels. And this is really the bulk of people who work in the informal sector. And at this moment, I really cannot say that how many people have actually come back. But the stories that we hear, when you don't have macro data, then what you have is real life stories. And in that, I think we really see that people have still not come back. Oxfam works in a lot of rural areas, including in areas like Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh. And my colleagues tell me that there's still people who are waiting to go back to their jobs that they had earlier. And that's not happened so far. So it is deep crisis that we are in. And we need to really address this question as well.
Let me ask you this, and I'm reading again out of your report. It says it will take an unskilled worker 10,000 years to make what Mukesh Ambani made in 1 hour during the pandemic. And it will take an unskilled worker 3 years to make what Mukesh Ambani made in 1 second during that pandemic. The report also notes that billionaires such as Gautam Adani, Shiv Nadar, Cyrus Poonawalla, Uday Kotak, Azim Premji, Sunil Mittal, Radhakrishna Devani, Kumar Mangalam Birla, Lakshmi Mittal, who work in sectors like coal, oil, telecom, medicines, pharmaceutical, education, and retail, increased their wealth exponentially when India was in a lockdown and economy came to a standstill. At that same time, 170,000 people lost their jobs every hour in the month of April. How is this possible? Yes, in the month of April last year. How is this possible that if the economy is in a standstill and people are losing, that nearly 2 lakh people are losing their jobs every hour, how is it that the rich got richer?
So that's the rigged economic system we have. a system which essentially rewards capital, and it actually furthers concentration of wealth. And that's what we saw. Instead of having a redistributive framework during the pandemic, what we were seeing is that people were actually getting, the top ones were further concentrating their wealth. And that happened across the world. And as you said, these are the top 11 billionaires that we have looked at. And they gained phenomenally during the pandemic. Whereas it was not getting percolated down to the common people. And in some ways, it would have further accentuated the concentration of wealth.
So effectively, you're saying that wealth moved from the poor into the hands of the rich.
It seems like that. It's fairly clear that such phenomenal gains that we have seen without new economic activity happening is also a clear signal of wealth moving and getting concentrated in the hands of few.
I also want to talk to you, if I may, about health and the inequality in healthcare. And I remember in previous reports that Oxfam has released in over the last couple of years, you kept pointing out the fact that in India, a poor family could get completely bankrupted by one illness or one surgery, where they mortgage their land or sell their home, sell all their family belongings, and put all of the money into the treatment of one individual, then leaving the entire family destitute. Again, COVID has perhaps brought us face to face with the fact that our public healthcare is inadequate and has not been invested in adequately. But again, was there a sharp division between, of course there was, between how the rich managed to look after themselves and what happened with the poor?
Sure. So there was a huge difference in terms of how the rich were able to access health. And our health system, particularly the private health system, was also extremely unregulated. So, there's enough report instances of how initially, and this is a case that we have in Delhi, a one room with a ventilator was going for 75,000 rupees a day in the early
Yes.
lockdown period. So that was, eventually then the government intervened and brought it down and capped it at, I think, 18,000 rupees. But rich people were able to afford ventilators. They were able to afford intensive care unit. Whereas the poor, we heard those stories of people actually dying outside the hospitals, and they were not able to access basic care.
Yes.
Because hospitals were also not equipped. Again, in my role as Oxfam's humanitarian work, we initially were supporting people who were walking back with food, but we also were trying to support hospitals. And we saw that outside the state capitals, and I would say even in the state capitals, the hospitals didn't even have PPEs for their doctors and paramedics. So the frontline workers were also extremely working in a challenging situation, and also therefore reluctant in providing the relief that was needed. And just to look at the systemic cause, let me just add one more figure. Sadly, India is ranked fourth from the bottom in terms of the investments on public health. That's bizarre, but we're really fourth from the bottom. Every government over the last 20, 30 years has been saying that we must have an investment of 2 to 3%. And this is across, whether it's UP or NDA. Every 5-year plan has talked of it. And what we see is something around just 1% of the GDP, which just does not address the question of public health. And let me say there is serious evidence across, and which is not contested, that if you have you make investments in health, public health and public education, you end up getting a more equal society. So look at all the equal societies, whether it's Norway, Sweden, Finland, the ones that we would know, and their investments in health and education is way higher than countries like India. So it's a sure inequality busting policy, but we've really not seen that.
We've not done it. And again, this is something Oxfam has been arguing now for several years, the investment in education and the investment in health being the silver bullet for India. But a lot of people could argue that we're already spending a lot of money on free healthcare and free education. It's the quality that is the problem, or the implementation that's a problem. Do you see this as something that can be solved with more money coming in from government?
So, I would say that one, we must challenge when people say that there's enough money invested. I just gave you the figure. As in, if you're really fourth from the bottom, and this we are talking of an economy which is, aspiring to be the third largest in 10 years, which is already the fifth largest at the moment, and to have such low investments is not all right. But just to still entertain the argument that you just talked of, you do need a critical minimum. Look at the government schooling system. Look at the central schools. Look at the Navodaya Vidyalayas. You need a critical minimum investment, institutional investment in teachers, and the results are fantastic. So if you just look at the Kendriya Vidyalayas, Navodayas, the quality of education is top class. But when you're not investing adequately in the school system, and pretty much almost by design, starving them of resources and making them inefficient, then what you're looking at is that a lot of parents, particularly in rural areas, we again see this, are taking out their children and sending them to private schools, which are of equally poor quality. There's the Azim Premji University report, which says though the quality of those private schools is not better, but still parents take out their children and send them to these private schools. And let me just say, even there's a caste and gender dimension. So who's left in the Sarkari school are usually the girls and children from the marginalized communities. So it is a complex question. It's been analyzed. There are answers, but where there's complete lack of willingness to actually address these questions.
You've also, in the report, talked about taxing the rich. Because as has been argued and as has been observed, and we probably know more about this in the next few days when the finance minister reads out the budget details for the year, we'll know how much money came in, how much money went out, and it's undoubted that the amount of money coming in through taxes will be sharply lower. Do you believe taxing the rich is the solution? And do you think we have the political will to do it? It's a very unpopular thing to do.
But Faye, we would want a world with less billionaires and many more nurses, if you're really looking at a just and equal society. Whether the government has the political will to do this or not is a question that obviously we need to address. But let me say that inequality is not inevitable. And there are policies, it's clearly, I would say, a policy choice. And budget is a strong reflection of those policy choices that the governments and regimes make. They must bite the bullet. They must, at least in this unprecedented year of difficulty, have some sort of a wealth tax. And let me also say that it's not going to be unique. Argentina has already done that. It has assessed on the super wealthy for COVID. And there are other examples. South Korea is thinking of very specific budgetary interventions for the super rich. So I do think that the government must bite the bullet, and it must clearly demonstrate that inequality is a concern they would like to address.
Do you think that by doing that, the government would have enough money that they need? Because there's actually three parts to this, right? So one is actually taking money from the rich, the Robin Hood tax, let's call it. Being able to implement it well enough to make up for the gap in budget, and then to use that gap in budget for the right things. Is there enough of an intent? Let's assume that there was no gap in budget and they actually did tax the rich. Do you believe that that money would be used for healthcare and education, which is where it needs to go? Or as it has always been, there have been other sort of demands on on those resources?
So let me just add one more part to it. You talked of three, but one more is just reaching out to uh, the rich, the super rich, the corporates, that they must pay the fair share of their taxes. Let's start from there. Even if you're not looking at the wealth tax, at this moment, let me again share a study from the Tax Justice Network. The Tax Justice Network study says that globally, countries lose almost $425 billion every year because of tax dodging. And we know that it's not that it does not happen in India. You have offshoring, you go to tax havens, people try and evade taxes in all possible ways. So I think that itself is going to be one important aspect of ensuring that you have greater revenues. Second is the political will, that it must to tax the super rich. I think we just discussed it. I think it's obscene that you can have one person making 90 crores in an hour when 24% of Indian population was living with 3,000 rupees a month. It's obscene. So we have to really tax the wealthy. Whether it will get distributed, that's really the political question. We are urging this government that they must make inequality as one of the fundamental fulcrums around which they must do their budget. And again, because over the years I've learned, governments learn from other governments. It's not that it's going to be again that India is going to be the first. Just look at New Zealand. I think it's absolutely remarkable where they have started calling their budgets as well-being budget. They've moved, and it is a well-being budget that they want to do. So maybe we can get some inspiration from New Zealand.
Well, one could argue that New Zealand is a tiny little island with a very small population. We're a far more complex country. But at the end of the day, again, there are other solutions that have been offered to government. Several economists, for example, have backed the idea of universal basic income, which is transfer a certain amount of money into the pockets of the very, very poor so that they're able to feed themselves, they're able to keep their children healthy, they're able to keep their children from being malnourished, because this will lead to more health problems, which will lead to further poverty, as you have pointed out. The other solution that has been offered is to put a lot of money into building infrastructure, thereby creating jobs which will employ people, which will then keep them employed. Your solution is to tax the rich and use the money to invest in healthcare and education. But that is a very long-term solution. It's not technically going to help us revive the economy right now, is it?
But that's one part of the solution. We are strongly suggesting that we need to have a strong COVID recovery plan. In that COVID recovery plan, we must ensure financial support for the people who have lost their livelihood. And then, in addition, we've been constantly saying people must also get a free vaccine. People have gone through such hardships, they must at least get the vaccine. And as you said, once they start getting some support, their ability to recover is going to be much greater. You will get some more money in the system. Also, while the government is investing back in the economic comeback, it must invest in greener technologies, greener sectors. Say, for instance, agriculture, and those. So it is a fundamental shift of how we look at the entire economic model. I would not feel comfortable in saying that, okay, let's just invest in heavy infrastructure. We've been doing that for decades. And what we are seeing is the inequality that we saw this year grow. And it's been a story for the last several years. Inequality is constantly growing. And whereas the poor are either at the same level or many of them are actually losing resources.
All right, Amitabh, many thanks for joining me and answering those questions and helping us understand this better. There are, of course, many problems for the government to look at, but If we allow the poor to slip further into poverty, we will then have an entire generation of children who will be raised malnourished. They will then not have developed body and mind and brain enough to really be able to compete and thrive as adults, sentencing them to a full lifetime of poverty. That then sentences our entire country to a whole generation of poverty. And unfortunately, this problem comes with a ticking clock. It has to be solved within a certain period of time. So we do hope that these voices and this research reaches the right people who are making these decisions right now. Thank you so much for joining us and answering our questions.